meetings don't work that way. Good evening. Great to see so many of you here this evening. I'd like to welcome both members of our own community here at Rice, and especially those from elsewhere in Houston who participate in cultural. I'm David Lieber, I'm president of Rice University, and we want to welcome, which is part of the President's Lecture Series in partnership with Imprint's Margaret Root Brown Reading Series. This lecture is actually also part of the Rice University Community of Asian Alumni celebration of the 100th anniversary of the first Asian American student at Rice, and we're pleased to host such a renowned member of the Asian American community. Rice University's President's Lecture Series was created to enrich the intellectual life of the Houston community by bringing to the Rice campus, quote, celebrities of substance, unquote, speakers of both high intellectual distinction and broad public appeal. We were recently privileged to have Captain Fred Hayes, astronaut on Apollo 13, speak here earlier to celebrate the 55th anniversary of President Kennedy's famous speech about going to the moon, which he delivered at Rice Stadium. Our partner this evening, Imprint, is the leading literary arts nonprofit in the Houston area. Its mission is to inspire readers and writers, which it achieves through the acclaimed Imprint Brown Reading Series, founded in 1980, Cool Brains, Imprint Readings for Young People, workshops for aspiring writers, senior citizens, K-12 teachers and children, and support for the nationally renowned University of Houston Creative Writing Program. We want to extend a special thank you to Imprint Houston. We at Rice believe that we are at our best when we find partners to work with here in the city and across the globe. And a special thanks to Viet Thanh Nguyen for coming here this evening to share his thoughts and perspectives with us. It's now my great privilege to welcome Rich Levy, Executive Director of Imprint Houston, to the stage to introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to collaborate with you and with Rice on this event, which we are delighted to present as the third installment of the 2017-2018 Imprint Margaret Root Brown Reading Series. I have to say, Rice has been so great in hosting Imprint after Harvey and the damage to the theater district. I know we are one of many organizations that's had the privilege of being here in Studi Concert Hall, including the Houston Symphony. Our thanks to you, to Dean Yekovich of the Shepherd School of Music, to David Medina of Rice Multicultural Community Relations, who brought us all together, and others at Rice for your civic-mindedness and hospitality. We first heard of Viet Thanh Nguyen in May 2015, just a few weeks after The Sympathizer was published. A publicist for Grove Atlantic put this debut novel in our hands and said, "You really need to have this guy in your reading series." And she was right. After a breathless 2.5 years, during which Viet has received the Pulitzer Prize, a MacArthur Fellowship, and many other honors, we are thrilled to have him here in Houston. A quick word about what's next in this 37th season of the Imprint Margaret Root Brown Reading Series. We start 2018 with a rare visit from the extraordinary writer, Pulitzer Prize winner, Jhumpa Lahiri, on January 29th. That's at the University of Houston Cullen Performance Hall. Tickets for this reading will go on sale tomorrow at noon on our website, imprinthouston.org. Details on the rest of the series, Paul Auster in February, Aminata Forna and Samantha Schweblin in March, and more, are in your program and on our website. where you can join the email list and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The Inprint Margaret Root Brown reading series is made possible by the generous support of the Brown Foundation and named for one of its founding trustees, Margaret Root Brown. The series is also underwritten by the National Endowment for the Arts, which affirms that art works. Inprint receives support from the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance and from the Texas Commission on the Arts. We owe big thanks tonight to our friends at Houston Public Media, with whom we are live streaming tonight's reading via the Inprint and Houston Public Media website. So, here's an idea. If you have a friend or family member anywhere in the world who wanted to be here tonight but couldn't, email them or text them right now and tell them to go to imprinthouston.org or houstonpublicmedia.org/imprint for the live stream. Tonight's program is also affiliated with Vietnam, the Houston Connection, organized in association with the PBS series, The Vietnam War. After the reading tonight, Viet will have a conversation here on stage with William Broyles, founding editor of Texas Monthly, Academy Award-nominated screenwriter, and author of Brothers in Arms, an account of his return to Vietnam to meet the men and women he fought against during the war. We are deeply grateful to Bill for his participation tonight. Then we'll move out to the lobby, and it's going to be way out that way somewhere. Just keep going and going and going. For the book sale and signing. Books are sold out here, but signing is out there. Our thanks to Brazos Bookstore, offering discounts on books by authors in the series. They have signed copies of Viet's books for sale. No photos, please, flash photos. No recording except for those authorized to do so. Finally, please set your phones on stun or silent mode. Thank you. Tonight's program has a brief biography of Viet that contains information on his works and honors, which I hope you'll read. Here's a bit more. In April 2017, the Los Angeles Times published an article by Viet titled, "In Praise of Doubt and Uselessness." There's a link to it on our website. It begins, almost 20 years ago, I arrived in Los Angeles with my doctorate from UC Berkeley, had turned 26 in February, and began preparing for a new career as a professor at USC. My naivete protected me when I sat down to write at my small kitchen table, and in that hot, stifling first summer began a short story collection. If I had known it would take me 17 years to finish that collection and 3 more to publish it, perhaps I would never have begun. He writes, "It was the willingness to sit in that chair for thousands of hours, receiving only occasional and minor recognition, enduring the grief of writing in the belief that somehow, despite my ignorance, something transformative was taking place. It was an act of faith, and faith would not be faith if it was not hard, if it was not a test, if it was not an act of willful ignorance, of believing in something that can neither be predicted nor proved by any scientific metric." Viet speaks of the novelist Haruki Murakami, who compares writing a novel to digging a hole through deep rock to reach a source of water. "Someone looking at me," he writes, might see that I have published 3 books in the last 3 years and think that I am fast-paced and prolific, without realizing it took 20 years of slow, very slow thinking and arduous labor to produce those books. We are here tonight to acknowledge and celebrate that dedication and faith and labor. Please give a rousing welcome, a warm Houston welcome to Viet Thanh Nguyen. Thank you.
Thanks, Houston. Thanks, Rich. Although I was going to try to make it look easy. Thanks so much, President Lebron, for that introduction as well. The first thing I always do is this. So, I can't help it, I'm Asian. I'm also a refugee, and that's another good reason to be here in Houston. I hear there are a lot of Vietnamese refugees who have come here and made a living here. Oh, by the way, I should also mention I'm from Los Angeles, and I'm happy that we could do our little bit to make you feel better after the flood. Yeah. I'm a refugee, and I came here in 1975 from Vietnam. And we were settled initially in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania from 1975 to 1978, and then we moved to San Jose, California from 1978 to 1988, which were really the formative years of my life because that was when I acquired the requisite emotional damage necessary to become a writer. It's true. And a lot of that damage came about from being a refugee. And so the refugee issues have always been very close to my heart, and when I wrote The Sympathizer, I intended it to be a novel about refugees in addition to being a novel about war. And for those of you who don't know what the novel is about, it's about a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army in April 1975 as Saigon is about to fall or be liberated, depending on your point of view. And his mission is to flee with the remnants of that army to the United States and to try to take their country back. Right? But in order to do that, he has to become a refugee as well. So this scene that I'm going to start off with is set in one of those refugee camps in the United States. I ended up in Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. My spy ends up in the much more glamorous Camp Pendleton in San Diego. And in this passage, what he's doing is he's writing a letter to his aunt in Paris describing what life is like in a refugee camp. If allowed to stay together, I told my aunt, we could have incorporated ourselves into a respectably sized, self-sufficient colony, a pimple on the buttocks of the American body politic, sufficiently collective to elect our own representative to the Congress and have a voice in our America. A little Saigon as delightful, delirious, and dysfunctional as the original, which was exactly why we were not allowed to stay together, but were instead dispersed by bureaucratic fiat. Wherever we found ourselves, we found each other. We did our best to conjure up the culinary staples of our culture, but since we were dependent on Chinese markets, our food had an unacceptably Chinese tinge. Another blow in the gauntlet of our humiliation that left us with the sweet and sour taste of unreliable memories. Just correct enough to evoke the past, just wrong enough to remind us that the past was forever gone. Missing, along with the proper variety, subtlety, and complexity of our universal solvent, fish sauce. Oh, fish sauce. How we missed it. How nothing tasted right without it. This pungent liquid condiment of the darkest sepia hue was much denigrated by foreigners for its supposedly horrendous reek, lending new meaning to the phrase, there's something fishy around here. For we were the fishy ones. We used fish sauce the way Transylvanian villagers wore cloves of garlic to ward off vampires. In our case, to establish a perimeter with those Westerners who can never understand that what was truly nauseating was a stench of cheese. What was fermented fish compared to curdled milk? But out of deference to our hosts, we kept our feelings to ourselves, sitting close to one another on prickly sofas and scratchy carpets, our knees touching under crowded kitchen tables, chewing on dried squid and the cud of remembrance until our jaws ached, trading stories heard second and third hand about our scattered countrymen. This was the way we learned of the Klan turned into slave labor by a farmer in Modesto, and the naive girl who flew to Spokane to marry her GI sweetheart and was sold to a brothel, and the widower with 9 children who went out into a Minnesotan winter and lay down in the snow on his back with mouth open until he was buried and frozen, and the regretful refugees on Guam who petitioned to go back to Vietnam, never to be heard from again, and the devout Buddhist who spanked his young son and was arrested for child abuse in Houston, and the husband who slapped his wife and was jailed for domestic violence in Raleigh, and the men who had escaped but left wives behind in the chaos, and the women who had escaped but left husbands behind, and the children who had escaped without parents and grandparents, and the families missing 1, 2, 3, or more children. Sifting through the dirt, we pan for gold. The story of the baby orphan adopted by a Kansas billionaire, or the mechanic who bought a lottery ticket in Arlington and became a multimillionaire, or the girl elected president of her high school class in Baton Rouge, or the boy accepted by Rice University from Fond du Lac. I'm just kidding. It was Harvard in the original. Or the movie star you loved so much, dear aunt, who circled the world from airport to airport, no country letting her in after the fall of Saigon, none of her American movie star friends returning her desperate phone calls until, with her last dime, she snagged Tippi Hedren, who flew her to Hollywood. So it was that we soaped ourselves in sadness, and we rinsed ourselves with hope. And for all that we believed almost every rumor we heard, almost all of us refused to believe that our nation was dead. So the Tippi Hedren story is actually true, and the movie star was Kieu Jin, who was the most famous movie star of South Vietnam from the 1950s through the 1970s. And Tippi Hedren came to Camp Pendleton and took such pity on the Vietnamese refugees that she encountered that she had her personal manicurist come and train some of these women in the arts of manicuring, which is how 40 years later, Vietnamese people have come to take over 51% of the nail salon industry in this country. Also a true story. Now, that's either a pro-refugee story or an anti-refugee story, depending on your point of view. Of course, from my perspective, it's a pro-refugee story. And I keep asserting this refugee identity of mine because I think it's so important, because it's so easy to overlook. When the novel, The Sympathizer, came out, one of the reactions to it that was really common was that people and reviewers were describing it as an immigrant story. And I thought, no, that's not right. I'm not an immigrant, I'm a refugee. And it's a really important distinction to make. Because immigrants are a part of the American mythology, right? They're a part of the American dream. If you're pro-immigrant, you believe that immigrants make this country great. And if you're anti-immigrant, of which there seems to be an increasing number in American society, even so, you still believe in immigrants because you think, of course immigrants would want to come here, we're awesome. And that's evidence of how great America is. But refugees are a completely different story. I'll give you an example. Some of the refugees who I describe in this section eventually settled in Louisiana. And then some years ago, Hurricane Katrina happened, and they became refugees again. And the American media who are covering Hurricane Katrina and covering all of these people who had been displaced described these people, some of the media, described them as refugees. President George Bush said, it's un-American to call these people refugees. And for perhaps the only time in history, Jesse Jackson agreed with him and said, it's racist to call African Americans refugees because so many of these displaced people were African Americans. And I thought, wow, it's great being a refugee. We've brought America together against us. So there is something that I think many Americans find extremely uncomfortable about refugees, and Americans are not unusual. A lot of Europeans find refugees uncomfortable as well, as we're seeing. So it's important to keep asserting that I'm a refugee, partly to say, hey, let in some more refugees. Maybe they'll win the Pulitzer Prize someday. But even more than that, it's just common human decency and morality to think about our obligations of hospitality. And I keep also talking about it because there are some refugees who have made it to this country, including some of my Vietnamese brothers and sisters who say we shouldn't let in any more refugees. You know why? Don't use us as an example, because we were the good refugees. And I thought, you're not the good refugees. You're the lucky refugees. You came at the right moment in time and history, at a moment when some Americans were feeling guilty about the war in Vietnam, and at a time when it was good politics to accept refugees from a communist country because it made us look better. So it's important to keep talking about refugees. It's important to keep comparing the past with the present. It's important to say, in 1975, the majority of Americans did not want to take Vietnamese refugees. But if you ask Americans today, they'll probably say Vietnamese Americans are a success story. We've gotten over our fear of them because we've gotten to know them. And history has proven time and again that that's usually what happens. So I've spent a lot of time over the past few decades trying to make sense of what it means to be a refugee, trying to make sense of the history that brought me here to this country. It's a very personal history for me, because when I came to Fort Indian Gap in Pennsylvania, I was 4 years old. And in order to leave a refugee camp in those days, a Vietnamese person had to have a sponsor, an American sponsor, take them out of the camp and ensure that they weren't going to be a burden on American society. So usually an entire Vietnamese family would be sponsored by another American family or an American church. But in my case, one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, and one sponsor took 4-year-old me, which when you're 4 years old doesn't make any sense. And I remember that as being a very traumatic experience. And it's as trivial as it was, because I was returned to my parents after 3 months or so, it stayed with me. And maybe it was one reason why, as I was growing up in San Jose, I was always very interested in the Vietnam War. I was always very interested in the history that had made me. And I would eventually also write a nonfiction book about it, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam in the Memory of War. So let me just read a brief bit from the very beginning and the end, and it's one of the few autobiographical things that I've written, and you'll get a better sense of why I'm screwed up the way that I am. Okay. I was born in Vietnam, but made in America. I count myself among those Vietnamese dismayed by America's deeds, but tempted to believe in its words. I also count myself among those Americans who often do not know what to make of Vietnam and want to know what to make of it. Americans, as well as many people the world over, tend to mistake Vietnam with the war named in its honor, or dishonor, as the case may be. This confusion has no doubt led to some of my own uncertainty about what it means to be a man with two countries, as well as the inheritor of two revolutions. Today, the Vietnamese and American revolutions manufacture memories only to absolve the hardening of their arteries. For those of us who consider ourselves to be inheritors of one or both of these revolutions, or who have been influenced by them in some way, we have to know how we make memories and how we forget them so that we can beat their hearts back to life. Remembering and forgetting entwine together, a double helix making us who we are, one never without the other. I want to remember, but so much has been forgotten or silenced. My own personal memory is faulty. Through my youth, I had a memory of soldiers firing from our boat onto another boat as we floated on the South China Sea. I was 4. My brother, 7 years older, says the shooting never happened. As an adult, I remembered my mother being hospitalized when I was a child. A few years ago, when I discovered a memoir that I had written in college, I read in my own words that she was in the hospital at that time, not years before. Her illness and that strange ward with its mumbling patients had made me feel like I was a frightened child. That was what I remembered. As for my father, it's pointless to ask him about the past. His relationship to the past is to muffle it, at least in my presence. Although I have visited his homeland, I have never visited my own origin, the town where I was born, because he has forbidden it. More than once, he has said to me, "You can never go back there." Too many people will remember him and persecute me, or so he believes. And while I have disobeyed my father in many things, I cannot in this one thing. The paternal injunction is too strong. The specter of the unknown past, too unsettling. What is it that he remembers of this place? What will he not tell me? What if he is right? I think back to my father's father and what happened to his remains. The Vietnamese believe a person should be buried twice. The first time, in a field removed from home and village, the earth eats the flesh. The second time, the survivors must disinter what remains. If they have timed it correctly, there will only be bones. If they have timed it wrong, there will still be flesh. Regardless of what they find, they must wash the bones with their own hands. Then they bury the bones once more, this time closer to the living. So when I heard about that burial custom, I thought, wow, this is a perfect metaphor to describe our relationship to the past and to the dead, and about whether that past remains buried or not, and how we cope with it. And as I was growing up in San Jose in the 1970s and the 1980s, I knew inarticulately that even if the war had been declared over in 1975, it wasn't really over. I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community, and they never stopped talking about the war. They had lost relatives. They had lost homes. They had lost identities. They had lost their country. And they were enormously angry and bitter and sad and melancholic and depressed and alcoholic and violent because of those feelings. But I also knew growing up in San Jose in the 1970s and 1980s that the rest of America had no idea that this was going on in the Vietnamese refugee community. And how did I know that? Well, I also happen to be, ironically enough, a war fanatic. Like, I really loved watching war movies and reading war books, and I always identified with the American soldiers, and I had a really good time, like watching John Wayne storm the sands of Iwo Jima, for example. Now, I was also the son of refugee parents who had opened the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, California. They worked 12 to 14-hour days out of love for me and my brother, but in another irony of immigration or refugee experience, that meant they had no time to spend with us. So I spent a lot of time reading these war books and other kinds of books, and I spent a lot of time with something called a VCR, okay? And you put a video cassette in here, and the first one I put in there was Star Wars. After I watched that a dozen times, and I was about 10 or 11 years old, after I watched that, the next movie that I put in was Apocalypse Now. Okay. You worry about kids with iPhones? Well, we had problems back in the day too with what you could put in that VCR. So I watched Apocalypse Now as rooting for the American soldiers. And I was rooting for the American soldiers up until the moment they killed the Vietnamese people. And then I felt myself split in two. And this was an enormously traumatic experience. Even a decade later in college, when I recounted that scene to a college class, I was surprised by being taken over by these feelings of rage and anger. My body and my voice were shaking. Because I realized that this is what stories can do. Stories can literally split you apart. It's not just guns that commit violence, it's stories that can commit violence as well. And that was what I was experiencing in the 1970s and 1980s. I was watching all these Vietnam War movies, and I understood something inarticulately that would later take me decades to articulate, which is that when Americans say the Vietnam War, they really mean the American war, what the war meant for Americans. So I think many Americans can tell you, 58,000 plus American soldiers died during the Vietnam War. That's a huge human tragedy. I'm not sure how many Americans can tell you that 3 million Vietnamese people died during the war on all sides. I'll bet even fewer Americans know that the war was fought in Laos and Cambodia as well, and that 3 million Laotians and Cambodians died during the years of the war and afterwards. Right? That's the kind of history that our community was steeped in and that I was steeped in. And it made me think about war very differently than many other Americans because, number one, it gave me empathy for people who are not Americans. So I'm always thinking when we see reports of American soldiers dying in Afghanistan or Iraq or Niger and so on, I think, well, that's sad. But what about all the stories we're not hearing? And then I think about the fact that growing up in this refugee community, most of the people who were traumatized by this war, or many of them, were not soldiers. They were civilians. So I teach a Vietnam War class. My students interview survivors of the Vietnam War. What they discover is that when they interview American veterans, some of those veterans have been through terrible combat experiences, but many have not. They were guarding a base or sitting on a ship. They interview Southeast Asian refugees, every single one has had a traumatic experience to make it over here. And this is a part of war too. But we don't think about that generally, because when we think about war, we think men, soldiers, combat, guns. And that's important. But I also think about civilians and the fact that the majority of the people who died during the Vietnam War were civilians. And the majority of the people who've died during 20th century wars have been civilians. And I think we need to understand that if we want to understand war. And we need to understand the military-industrial complex if we want to understand war, not just the stories of soldiers and combat. So anyway, I would then go on and write The Sympathizer as a way of working out my screwed up feelings. And I couldn't help myself. I had to take revenge on Hollywood. So, maybe I went on for too long. There's like 4 chapters devoted to this. I'm just going to read a couple of pages. My spy, he has to get a job after he leaves that refugee camp. So he gets a job as the authenticity consultant on the making of a movie that looks suspiciously like Apocalypse Now. But if Francis Ford Coppola were asked, it's not Apocalypse Now. Okay? Instead, this is a movie called The Hamlet, and it's about American Green Berets in Vietnam whose task it is to train the ethnic minorities of the Central Highlands, whom they call the Montagnards, to defend themselves against communism. And our spy has given the famous director, who's known only as the auteur, notes on his screenplay. And this is the aftermath of that. My meeting with the auteur had gone on for a while longer, mostly in a more subdued fashion, with me pointing out that the lack of speaking parts for Vietnamese people in a movie set in Vietnam might be interpreted as cultural insensitivity. Do you not think it would be a little more believable, I said? A little more realistic? A little more authentic? For a movie set in a certain country, for the people in that country to have something to say, instead of having your screenplay direct, as it does now, cut to villagers speaking in their own language? Do you think it might not be decent to let them actually say something, instead of simply acknowledging that there's some kind of sound coming from their mouths? I'm sorry, there's an Amber Alert coming off on my phone right now. Okay. Could you not even just have them speak a heavily accented English? You know what I mean. Ching Chong English? Just to pretend that they're speaking in an Asian language that somehow American audiences can strangely understand? The auteur grimaced and said, "Very interesting. Great stuff. Loved it. But I had a question." "What was it?" "Oh, yes. How many movies have you made?" "None." "Isn't that right? None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. And however you say it in your language. So thank you for telling me how to do my job. Now get the hell out of my house and come back after you've made a movie or two. Maybe then I'll listen to one or two of your cheap ideas." Since the book came out, I've actually had the opportunity to meet quite a few Hollywood people. And none of them dispute this characterization. Bill might later, so we'll see. I confess to being angry with the auteur. But was I wrong in being angry? This was especially the case when he acknowledged he did not even know that Montagnard was simply a French catch-all term for the dozens of Highland minorities. What if, I said to him, I wrote a screenplay about the American West and simply called all the natives Indians? You'd want to know whether they were the cavalry was fighting the Navajo or Apache or Comanche, right? Likewise, I would want to know, when you say these people are montagnards, whether we speak of the Bru, or the Nung, or the Tay. Let me tell you a secret, the auteur said. You ready? Here it is. No one gives a shit. He was amused by my wordlessness. To see me without words is like seeing one of those Egyptian felines without hair, a rare and not necessarily desirable occasion. How could I be so dense? How could I be so deluded? I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivete in believing they had to visit a country in order to exploit it. Hollywood was much more efficient imagining the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors. Courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created. With all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis, who never achieved global domination. Hollywood's high priests understood innately the observation of Milton's Satan, that it was better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. Better to be villain, loser, or anti-hero than virtuous extra, so long as one commanded the bright lights of center stage. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe-l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor, the innocent, the evil, or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute. We were to be struck dumb. So even before The Sympathizer came out, I knew that a certain something would be said about this book. And lo and behold, The Sympathizer comes out. It gets a great review on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, for which I'm very grateful. But in the third line of the review, it says, Viet is the voice for the voiceless. I was like, no, that's not true. Have you ever met any Vietnamese people? Gone to a Vietnamese restaurant? Been to a Vietnamese family gathering? We're very loud. We're not voiceless. We're just not heard. It's a big difference. And as a matter of fact, it was also kind of depressing thinking about the fact of being the voice for the voiceless, because I'm pretty sure that there were other Vietnamese American voices for the voiceless who preceded me. In fact, if you go to Google and you type in Vietnamese American literature, it'll turn up 15 or 20 writers writing in English that you can read. So to be called the voice for the voiceless is actually not a compliment. It's a backhanded compliment. Because I'm pretty sure a few years from now, there will be another Vietnamese American voice for the voiceless. And the problem here is that nothing changes. Nothing changes. People want a voice for the voiceless so they don't have to listen to all the many people clamoring to be heard. They can just hear the one representative. And I'm not the representative. I keep insisting that. I wrote a book or books about Vietnam and about the war and the refugee experience. But even if you go within my own family, there's a dozen other opinions on what this history means. And to have a truly just and equal society, at least when it comes to storytelling and representation, means that we have many, many voices from many, many different experiences. And just because we're Vietnamese doesn't mean we're all the same. So we can't just have one voice for the voices. We need many of those. And so part of the challenge for any minority writer of any background, doesn't have to be racial or cultural, is that we're up against this perception There's only room for one of us voices for the voiceless. And literature can only do so much to change that. You know? But when I was learning how to write, I knew this problem existed, but it was so hard just to write stories that I couldn't figure out how to grapple with that as an aesthetic problem. You know, I was writing The Refugees. I wrote The Refugees before I wrote The Sympathizer. And as Rich pointed out, it took me 17 years. You know, and I started off writing short stories because I thought, short stories are short. That means it must be easier. Actually, the shorter things get, the harder they get. It took me 17 years to figure that out. But I was struggling so much with the art of the story, of trying to write a short story, that I couldn't even deal with what it meant to be a voice for the voiceless. So The Refugees is very much a set of stories that attempts to be the voice for the voiceless, that attempts to humanize the Vietnamese people and Vietnamese refugees who were less than human in the American imagination. And the reason why that's important outside of the United States is that everywhere I go in this world, and I tell people that I'm researching the Vietnam War, they say, "Have you seen Apocalypse Now?" And I ask them, "Have you seen a Vietnamese movie?" And almost no one has seen a Vietnamese movie, right? So how Americans perceive this has enormous global impact on how the Vietnamese story is heard or not heard overseas. So I'm just going to read a couple pages from The Refugees, the opening, a story called Black-Eyed Women. And it very much is about these themes of humanity and voices that I've been mentioning. Fame would strike someone, usually the kind that healthy-minded people would not wish upon themselves, such as being kidnapped and kept prisoner for years, humiliated in a sex scandal, or surviving something typically fatal. These survivors needed someone to help write their memoirs, and their agents might eventually come across me. "At least your name's not on anything," my mother once said. When I mentioned that I would not mind being thanked in the acknowledgments, she said, "Let me tell you a story." When I mentioned that I would not mind being thanked in the, I'm sorry, I just read that. "In our homeland," she went on, "there was a reporter who said the government tortured the people in prison. So the government does to him exactly what he said they did to others. They send him away, and no one ever sees him again. That's what happens to writers who put their names on things." By the time Victor Devoto chose me, I had resigned myself to being one of those writers whose names did not appear on book covers. His agent had given him a book that I had ghostwritten, its ostensible author, the father of a boy who had shot and killed several people at his school. "I identify with the father's guilt," Victor said to me. He was the sole survivor of an airplane crash, 173 others having perished, including his wife and children. What was left of him appeared on all the talk shows, his body there, but not much else. The voice was a soft monotone, and the eyes, on the occasions they looked up, seemed to hold within them the silhouettes of mournful people. His publisher said that it was urgent that he finish his story while audiences still remembered the tragedy, and this was my preoccupation on the day my dead brother returned to me. My mother woke me while it was still dark outside and said, "Don't be afraid." Through my open door, the light from the hallway stung. Why would I be afraid? When she said my brother's name, I did not think of my brother. He had died long ago. I closed my eyes and said, "I do not know anyone by that name." But she persisted. "He's here to see us," she said, stripping off my covers and tugging at me until I rose, eyes half shut. She was 63, moderately forgetful, and when she led me to the living room and cried out, I was not surprised. "He was right here," she said, kneeling by her floral armchair as she felt the carpet. "It's wet." She crawled to the front door in her cotton pajamas, following the trail. When I touched the carpet, it was damp. For a moment, I twitched in belief, and the silence of the house at 4 a.m. felt ominous. Then I noticed the sound of rainwater in the gutters, and the fear that had gripped my neck relaxed its hold. My mother must have opened the door, gotten drenched, then come back inside. I knelt by her as she crouched next to the door, her hand on the knob, and said, "You're imagining things. I know what I saw. Brushing my hand off her shoulder, she stood up, anger illuminating her dark eyes. He walked. He talked. He wanted to see you. Then where is he, Ma? I don't see anyone. Of course you don't, she sighed, as if I were the one unable to grasp the obvious. He's a ghost, isn't he? So it's a ghost story, and I don't even like ghost stories. I'm easily scared. And that's one of the reasons why this particular story took me 50 drafts over 17 years. And I think it's because the story didn't break me as a writer that I became a writer. But it was through that work of struggling with the stories that I eventually came to The Sympathizer and had a breakthrough, and I realized I don't have to do this anymore. I know how to tell a story. I know how to prove people's humanity. I don't need to prove anybody's humanity anymore. Aren't we already human as Vietnamese people? Why do we have to proceed from the assumption that we have to work against a stereotype or against racism? And so with The Sympathizer, I decided that I was done with proving humanity. And as a matter of fact, what I was much more interested in was the inhumanity of Vietnamese people. Because I felt that that had been sort of denied to us. You know, we had been treated as inhuman on the screen of American movies, for example. But that was in a one-dimensional way. I was interested in the inhumanity of our complex subjectivity. So for example, when you watch Apocalypse Now and you see American soldiers massacring innocent Vietnamese civilians, I don't think too many audience members come out of that experience thinking, gosh, Americans are really horrible people. They come out thinking, well, that is a compelling depiction of the human soul under trials and tribulations of war. And it makes people do terrible things. And that's the kind of reaction I wanted for The Sympathizer. So I created a character for The Sympathizer who was a spy, a liar, an alcoholic, a womanizer, and ultimately a murderer. So it's completely autobiographical. Maybe the alcoholic part, you know. If you go with me to the bar after this, I'll show you. But I didn't want to create someone who was simply going to be a victim, but who could have that complete, complex, complicated subjectivity that so often is reserved for the majority. And it seems, I guess, maybe I've been painting kind of a bleak picture of Vietnamese American life. Well, I want to end on a slightly happier note, which is a true story, which is that after the Vietnamese refugees left Camp Pendleton and moved to Los Angeles, one of the first things that they did was to open a nightclub, you know, because we like to sing and dance and drink and do naughty things. So this last reading is set in this nightclub, and it is where our spy falls in love with the one woman he should not fall in love with, Lana, the daughter of his boss, the general. Now known by just one name, like John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Mary, Lana stepped on stage, clad in a red velvet bustier, a leopard print miniskirt, black lace gloves, and thigh-high leather boots with stiletto heels. My heart would have paused at the boots, the heels, or the flat, smooth slice of her belly, naked in between miniskirt and bustier. But the combination of all three arrested my heart altogether and beat it with the vigor of a Los Angeles police squad. They don't laugh about that in LA. Pouring cognac over my heart freed it. But thus drenched, it was easily flambéed by her torch song. She turned on the heat with her first number, the unexpected, "I'd love you to want me," which I'd heard before, sung only by men. "I'd love you to want me" was a theme song of the bachelors and unhappily married males of my generation, whether in the English original or the equally superb French and Vietnamese renditions. What the song expressed so perfectly From lyric to melody was unrequited love. And we men of the South love nothing more than unrequited love. Cracked hearts are our primary weakness after cigarettes, coffee, and cognac. Listening to Lana sing, all I wanted was to immolate myself in a night with her to remember forever and ever. Every man in the room shared my emotion as we watched her do no more than sway at the microphone, her voice enough to move the audience, or rather, to still us. Nobody talked, and nobody stirred, except to raise a cigarette or a glass, in utter concentration not broken for her next, slightly more upbeat number, Bang Bang, My Baby Shot Me Down. Lana's version of Bang Bang layered English with French and Vietnamese. The last line of the French version echoed Pham Dui's Vietnamese version, "We will never forget." In the pantheon of classic pop songs from Saigon, this tricolor rendition was one of the most memorable, masterfully weaving together love and violence in the enigmatic story of two lovers who, regardless of having known each other since childhood, or because of knowing each other since childhood, shoot each other down. Bang Bang was the sound of memory's pistol firing into our heads. For we could not forget love. We could not forget war. We could not forget lovers. We could not forget enemies. We could not forget home. And we could not forget Saigon. We could not forget the caramel flavor of iced coffee with coarse sugar, the bowls of noodle soup eaten while squatting on the sidewalk, the strumming of a friend's guitar while we swayed on hammocks under coconut trees, the working men who slept in their ciclos on the streets, kept warm only by the memories of their families, the refugees who slept on every sidewalk of every city, the sweetness and firmness of a mango plucked fresh from its tree, the girls who refused to talk to us and who we only pined for more, the men who had died or disappeared, the streets and homes blown away by bombshells, the shadows cast by candlelight on the walls of wattled huts, the barking of a hungry dog in an abandoned village, the sight and sound of orphans howling by the dead bodies of their mothers and fathers, the stickiness of one's shirt by afternoon, the stickiness of one's lover by the end of lovemaking, the stickiness of our situations. And while the list could go on and on and on, the point was simply this. The most important thing we could never forget was that we could never forget. Thank you.
Am I on? Yes? That was fantastic,
Thanks, Bill.
I have to say. And as a veteran of Vietnam who fought there, and as a writer, I've been waiting for you. The stories you're telling and the way you're telling them is such a missing piece in my own experience. And as you point out in your essays, there are a number of terrific writers out of Vietnam today, writing about the war from their own memories and filling in those pieces of the puzzle. I mean, I was really struck, and I was struck with you writing the books like this, that the idea that stories have power. And because when I was fighting in Vietnam, I realized that the most powerful weapon we had wasn't our bombs and our rockets and our guns, but those stories in our heads that let us push the button and pull the triggers on people very much like us. So that, when I went back to Vietnam and talked to the people I'd fought against, and the veterans and the NVA and the Viet Cong, one of the things that I found so interesting is that, you talk about the other and how that idea lets us kill people who are like us. these were the former other for me. But when we talked, we realized that we were the only ones who had been in the rice paddies in the mountains and fought in the war, and that we had more in common than I did with Americans who didn't fight and they did with the new generation. So I'm really curious as to how your story that you saw changed when you went back to Vietnam for the first time, because my going back changed my story tremendously. So what was it like when you went back?
Well, first, it's a real honor to be on the stage with you. You know, you're a master storyteller, and you've contributed to our understanding of the Vietnam War in different ways with China Beach and just with your art of storytelling and filmmaking.
Isn't he great?
Yeah, but it's true. Apollo 13, Castaway. You've seen Bill's movies, and I grew up, watching China Beach in the '80s. And you're absolutely right. Stories are just as important to war as weapons are. And I think stories are the first weapons. We have to persuade people, young people, to go fight a war, to kill people who are human, but to persuade them that they're not human. And I knew from an early age how powerful stories were as a young boy, as I talked about here. But also, my parents had that grocery store in San Jose, and I walked down the street when I was about 10 or 11, and I saw a sign in a store window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." Mm-hmm. And that sign has always stayed with me. And I didn't understand what was going on at the time, but I understood later. That's a story. There's a whole story behind there, and it's a story that's connected to the story that gets us to kill other people by dehumanizing them and turning them into a threat. And it's not just Americans versus Vietnamese, though. A lot of Vietnamese refugees are afraid of going back to Vietnam because that's the land of their enemy now. And my parents, it took them 2 decades to go back to Vietnam.
They went?
Oh yeah, they went in the early. Well, the funny thing is, when I was growing up, my dad would tell me, "You're 100% Vietnamese." Then they go back to Vietnam twice in the early '90s, and I didn't go with them. I didn't see what they saw. After the second time, they came back, and over Thanksgiving, my father said to me, "We're Americans now." So I was very curious, and I went back to Vietnam, but I was also fearful. Because we had left behind an adopted sister, my adopted sister, my oldest sister. And when I was growing up, we had a picture of her in the family photo album. It was the only picture we had of her. And I grew up with the sense that somebody was missing in our family, that there was a ghost, there was an absent presence. So the haunting that I talk about in my stories was real for me. And so to go back to Vietnam meant to encounter that, to try to figure out how to deal with that emotionally. And I'm not good with emotions. That's why I became a writer, okay? I can deal with emotions in the book, but with real human beings, it's much more problematic. So I was very fearful going back to Vietnam. And the first time in 2002, I went back as a tourist. Went back for 2 weeks, had a great time. Didn't deal with family. Second time I went back for 7 months, so I could study the language, and then I could go back and meet my family. And it was a challenging experience. I think, we think about, here in this country, we're still fighting the Vietnam War. We're still fighting the Civil War. That was 150 years ago. The Vietnam War was only 40 years ago, and it was a civil war for the Vietnamese people as well. So it's a really fraught emotional experience, economic experience. I think that, I'll summarize it in one way, which is, I think that when I encounter Vietnamese people, they're oftentimes very happy to see me. But they treat me as a Vietnamese person when they want my love. And they treat me as an American when they want my money. Okay, and all of that is wrapped up with returning to Vietnam.
Yes, so there is that sense in The Sympathizer where he leaves Vietnam twice. Once as a refugee at the highest level, and the second time as a refugee in the hold of a boat. But both times it's this sort of cyclical journey, both physical and memory, where I was so curious as to how you're perceived by the Vietnamese who are there. And so you're really an other in a way to them, right?
I think so, but I think...
But not quite the way I would, you know what I mean? It's just different, but there's a...
Well, it's an uneven situation. Okay, so many Americans who are not Vietnamese go to Vietnam or go back to Vietnam, and they go with a lot of trepidation too, because they think, we fought a bad war here, and maybe the Vietnamese won't like us and so on. But every single one has said to me, "You know what? We were treated so well. The Vietnamese were so friendly. They put the war behind them, But when you're Vietnamese and you go back, it's much more complicated, because it's that Civil War thing, but it's also when you go back, people look at you, your own relatives, and they think you're the lucky one. Okay, they don't think about the fact that half the people who tried to flee by boat died or disappeared. They think about the fact, oh, you're a fat American now, and you're the lucky one. So it's a very fraught experience to do that. And I don't know, I think the way that the Vietnamese see me, I think, is as an other because I'm this overseas Vietnamese person. But when I was growing up in the Vietnamese refugee community in this country, I felt like an other too. Right? Because most of the Vietnamese people I knew were very Vietnamese, spoke Vietnamese all the time, including people my own age. I was one of the few people my own age who was really not good at speaking Vietnamese in San Jose. And I'm sure people thought like I was whitewashed or a banana and so on. And now, the generation of Vietnamese American kids growing up now are just like me, But back then, I felt like I was, in my parents' Vietnamese household, an American spying on them. And when I stepped out into the American world, I was a Vietnamese spying on Americans. And so now, when I'll tell you another story. When the novel won the Pulitzer Prize, my dad called me on the road. I hadn't told him I won the Pulitzer Prize. And he said, the relatives in Vietnam called, you won the Pulitzer Prize. And then people from Vietnam were telling me, hey, you won the Pulitzer Prize, but you know what? The unofficial media, or the non-state media, is saying, Nguyễn Thanh Viet, me, won the Pulitzer Prize. The state media is saying, somebody won the Pulitzer Prize. So, you know what I'm saying? It's like, there's still a very ambivalent relationship to what I and my book represent to Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, have your parents read The Sympathizer?
My dad told me that he had started to read it, which is, I give all credit to my dad. Every time I publish a book, I go home, I give my parents a book, and they put it on the shelf. They say, we're proud of you, and that's it, okay? And, you can partially blame it on the language difficulties. My dad can speak English, and, my parents came here as refugees, and they did something that I could never do, which is they came to a strange country, and they completely rebuilt their lives. They can do English, right? But not literary English. Right. So then one time I gave my dad a translated short story of mine into Vietnamese. And it's a story about a Vietnamese refugee, and the refugees is called The Other Man. And he comes to the United States and he discovers that he's gay. So I give my dad this translated Vietnamese short story that he can read, and we never talk about it again. So I think my dad has read the Vietnamese press language accounts of my book, so he knows the plot and everything, and he knows that it's from the perspective of a communist spy, which is enough for some people in the Vietnamese American community to say, we're never going to read this book. How can you possibly tell a story from the perspective of our enemy? But I guess my dad, because he's my dad, will try, and he's going to have to wait for the Vietnamese translation if it ever comes out to do the whole thing.
Well, there's always your parents sitting on your shoulder when you're writing, and I think particularly listening to your story and reading about it, and you would think a lot of the first generations, like refugees that I know, their parents have really wanted them to go become a lawyer or become a doctor, and you went off and studied ethnic studies and literature. Were your parents, what did they think that you were doing? What did they think?
That's a good question. Well, my parents are extremely strict people. They work 12 to 14 hours a day. They're okay. I don't know how many people will know anything about Catholicism. Okay, the stereotypes are true. Catholicism is intensely hierarchical, and Vietnamese culture is intensely hierarchical, and you bring them together, and you get super duper hierarchical religious culture. And that's my parents, But strangely, they were liberal in one respect, and that was education. And I think that was because my dad only had high school, and my mom had grade school, and they basically made their own fortunes just based on their own talents. So, but they wanted my brother and I to be educated. They didn't want my brother and I to work in a grocery store. So my brother, he went to Harvard. Okay, it's like 7 years after he got to this country, not knowing any English. But he went to Harvard and he studied philosophy. But he also did pre-med. You don't want this guy for your brother, okay? He's like, Harvard, philosophy, pre-med, Stanford Medical School, became a doctor, all this kind of stuff. But in one way, it was...
He went the other way.
I was supposedly the black sheep in the family. And that's because I studied English. But I think my brother told me, look, just do English, but tell mom and dad you're going to be a lawyer. And that's what I did. So I held them off for 4 years, like I'm going to go to law school, I'm going to law school, and then then it came time to do something with my life, and I thought I can't be a lawyer. I took the LSAT and I did okay, but I realized I did something like 88 percentile, and I realized that's not good enough to get into the top 5 law schools, and who would bother not going to a top 5 law school? That was my mentality. That's like the Asian American mentality, like model minority. If you're not in the top 5, you're nothing. And so I decided to go to graduate school and get a PhD. And I could not go home to my parents and they're working 12 to 14-hour days in a grocery store. Hey, mom and dad, I'm going to study the Romantic poets. So the ethnic studies major was very important for me in the fact that, I was reading African American literature, Asian American literature, Chicano literature, and I felt that this literature actually was connecting to the world. That idea that stories can change perceptions, change realities, change the American story. These stories gave me the sense that, I could do this too. And that's not what I told my parents. What I told my parents is, I'm going to get a job. That's what they cared about. But in my own mind, it was like, the job I'm going to get is to try to change stories.
See, that's when you talk about the importance of the industry of memory and how Hollywood is really like at the wheel of the most powerful storytelling medium ever invented, right? And what I thought was interesting, really compelling to me about your book, Nothing Ever Dies, was the importance of looking at that industry of memory and seeing how we could transform it. And I'm really curious for you to talk about this. One of the things in your book, you talk about Jarhead, which is a film I wrote. And one of the things that was interesting to me as telling the story of this Iraq One vet was the way Vietnam, what you call my war, which I call our war, resonated with these kids. And how if you look at Apocalypse Now the way Francis might have conceived it as like an anti-war movie about the descent into savagery and so on, it's like there's a scene in Jarhead, if you saw it, I'm going to plug my own movie, where the guys are watching Apocalypse Now, and the very scene that Viet was talking about where they're rocketing the Vietnamese village, which to me is horrific, these guys are cheering, get some! And it was this extraordinary thing we were trying to convey, how one generation's anti-war movie becomes the next generation's recruiting film. And part of that, what do you think causes that? And what can we do? Because there's an inevitability that we're telling it from our POV. And as you point out, even anti-heroes, when you're in their POV, become sympathetic. So how do we change that? So that the world isn't always just extras and targets in our own movies.
That's a great scene. I teach it in my Vietnam War class, actually, because I think you had scripted it in such a way and the director done it in such a way that the point was so vividly clear. And it's important to speak about the industry of memory rather than just art, because I think that if we don't understand that art takes place in relationship to industries, we don't really have an understanding of how art works. It's not like you just write a book or make a movie in some ethereal space. You got to deal with people. You have to deal with economies, right? So Hollywood is dominated by a certain group of people, white men, and and the publishing industry is 87% white, although it's a little bit different because it's like majority female. But the composition of industries has an impact on what gets produced. So that's why I was saying the voice for the voiceless is a backhanded compliment because it does nothing to change the industry of memory. The industry of memory or the industry of publication will let one voice emerge at a time, as long as 87% gets to stay white. Okay? We have to actually change the industries of publication, of art, of filmmaking, of memory, if we actually want to change storytelling, to get radically different perspectives into it. And so that's why with the last scene that I read in the nightclub, that is an industry of memory. That nightclub would go on to become Paris by Night. The Vietnamese people who were excluded from Hollywood said, okay, we're never going to get a Hollywood movie made. What we're going to do, we're going to do our own song and dance review. And literally, Paris by Night is probably into 120 episodes by now, shot all over the world and seen even in Vietnam. That's what they had to do. They had to create their own industry of entertainment and memory. And with Hollywood's war movies, I think the issue is, that's why I was trying to stress that wars should not be seen only as men and guns and combat. Because if it is, you're never going to get out of the problem that you just talked about. And that is that when you show men and guns and combat, it doesn't matter that you show that war is hell. The spectacle is so compelling. You know, watching Saving Private Ryan, the first 30 minutes, people getting blown up all over. It's really graphic, really horrible. War is hell. I'll bet a lot of kids watched that movie and said, I want to join the army. Because no one believes they're going to die. You don't believe you're going to die. Okay, maybe you believe you're going to die and get a Medal of Honor posthumously. No one believes they're going to be the person who gets their legs blown off and can never walk again for the rest of their life. Now, that's a war story that Hollywood doesn't want to tell, for the most part. There's been a few exceptions. But war stories, if we reimagine war stories to indicate that wars are actually, you know, outside of the people who actually have to go to fight the wars are actually really boring. They're about logistics, they're about paying taxes, they're about, you know, the 90% of the people who are not fighting in combat. And then they're about the suicides and the PTSD and everything else. That's a really depressing war movie.
Yeah.
No one wants to watch that.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting too, and I know you've been to lots of memorials and monuments of commemorating the dead in Vietnam and here and all over, and how the stories that they tell, how they fuel this industry of memory. And I was thinking, I just watched Dunkirk and Saving Private Ryan, and again, that's part of our point of view about World War II. And just to take a different war, is that we, you know, and our allies were driven out of Europe in Dunkirk, returned triumphantly in Saving Private Ryan. We destroyed Nazism and free Europe. That's our story. Well, the real story of World War II is the Russians fight the Germans for 40 long years, lose 20 million people. We come up at the end, fight 5% of the Germans, and take all the credit. And that's our story. And it also creates in us a sense that we can save things. You know, there is a narrative there that, you know, I mean, the Vietnam War was like 14 years officially, right? And that's longer than the Civil War, World War I, and World War II put together. But we're in a war right now, and it's been going on longer than that. And very few of the people here know any of the narrative of what's really going on, who's suffering, who's fighting, who's dying. And that's another thing that you've sort of written about, which I think is really interesting, is the passive complicity of those of us who don't fight the war, and how that keeps things going as well. And I'm really curious, without getting too much into the politics of it, is that how do these memories of Vietnam kind of translate and get rebuilt into what we're doing right now? Because as I say, this is the longest war we've ever fought. As you pointed out, all your students have grown up knowing nothing but war. Mm-hmm. It's like a forever war. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that, you know, we've been talking a lot about Americans, but it's not just Americans who do these kinds of things. If you go to Vietnam, you see the exact same thing, which is that in Vietnam, the memorials and the stories there, yeah, they affirm that nation, or that the Communist Party's point of view, right? And it's about how the Vietnamese were victorious and saved the country and kicked out the French and the Americans, and the South Vietnamese were the puppets and traitors and so on. So every country does that, and the reason why they do that is because memory is a strategic resource when it comes to fighting war. It's just as important as oil. You need to control memories in order to persuade people today to fight the wars of the present and the future. And that has been what has happened with the Vietnam War too. And in the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War, for Americans anyway, I think most Americans saw it as a bad war. We shouldn't have done it, terrible things happened and so on. But interestingly, in the decades since, there's been a concerted effort to transform those memories on the part of the presidency, the Pentagon, the government, and it's been bipartisan. It's not like a Democratic or Republican effort. in 1978, 1979, Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, said this was a war of mutual destruction, which is a complete lie. It's not a war of mutual destruction. 58,000 dead versus 3 million dead is not mutual destruction. And, totally bombing Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, dropping more bombs on them than were dropped in all of Europe during World War II when the United States was never touched. That's not mutual destruction. But that was part of the beginning of the campaign of transforming the meaning of the war, so that today, even though there's still the perception that it's a bad war among many people, there's also this perception that it was maybe a noble but flawed effort, that many Americans have this perception too. And in a practical sense, the Pentagon has learned from the lessons of the Vietnam War, but the Pentagon has a memory too. And that's why we don't have a draft. That's why the media is not given free access in the wars that we fight. That's why the military is isolated from our population. That's why we use drone weapons instead of carpet bombing. These are all strategic lessons that have been derived from the Vietnam War as an exercise of remembering the war in order to fight current wars supposedly better.
Yeah. I kind of feel like I'm a little part of that. Can you hear me? Am I losing my thing? The Vietnam Memorial was dedicated in 1982. And a lot of us, I helped do that, it was built really to give a sense that those who fought the war should have some recognition. And one of the things that Viet does in his book is point out that rehabilitated the image of the American fighting man, person, and gave a sense actually of guilt on the part of the American people for not supporting them more. So now we have, I think, this really interesting thing where we fetishized American soldiers and fighting people without really knowing what they actually do. I mean, you go to our sporting events and there's jets flying over and there's all this thank you for your service, and we're actually on Veterans Day weekend. And that's all really important, but it does kind of give a free pass to what are we doing? And I think that's the interesting thing you captured in your book, is to look at the complexity of these things and how we really have to think about it. And I wanted just to before we run, I want to get to the end. One of the things that I thought was interesting when I went back to Vietnam, two things, is in a place called Tan Trao, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, far in the north, there's a banyan tree in this tiny little area. And it's where Ho Chi Minh in 1945 announced the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam. And the first words are, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." I mean, it was literally quoting our Declaration of Independence. And under that same tree, General Giap, who was the leader of the North Vietnamese, began the Viet Minh, which became the North Vietnamese Army. There were a few OSS Americans there helping them because they were fighting the Japanese at the time. So after I got back from my second tour of Vietnam, I called one of them up. His name was Allison Thomas. He was a lawyer in Lansing, Michigan. And I said, "Listen, Mr. Thomas, you were there. You knew Ho Chi Minh. You knew General Giap. You worked with them. You knew what made them tick. You knew what they were like. What did you tell the architects of the Vietnam War when they called you to ask for your intelligence and what you knew?" "Oh, nobody ever called me. Nobody was interested. We tried to tell them, but they said, we know all we need to know." And there's this lack of curiosity and this closed sense that you get from being in your point of view. And I think that's what we see in film and Hollywood, is that even when we're doing something bad, we're the ones doing it. It's interesting that you point out that even being the anti-hero means that the other people are still the extras, right? So I thought that was really interesting, because when you talked about being the child of two revolutions, and they're both failed and how we redeem their ideals, I mean, I'm really curious as to how you feel. I mean, because in one level, you're making art, and you're doing it, and it's fantastic. But at another level, it has effects, and are you hoping that the people read your books come out with some more curiosity about the other? That's a long question.
Yeah.
Just say yes or no.
Yes, I do. Well, first of all, let me just say the books are funny too, and they're entertaining, and all of that kind of stuff.
That's
and
true. The humor is incredible. As you heard.
And then after that, then I think that's what literature is supposed to do. I think just fiction, books that we read and we forget, don't do that for us. But literature, whatever we call literature, it is supposed to transform us in some way. It's supposed to shift us in some way. It's supposed to make us see the world in a different way. It's supposed to make us to see the other in a different way. And if it unsettles us, some of us may not want to be unsettled, but that is an important thing, to shake us from our foundations, to shake us from things that we hold so dear that we can't see outside of them.
Yeah.
But it's a dangerous thing to do. Like when you disturb people, they don't always react well. So lovers of literature, we read books because we want to be unsettled, but we're not everybody. So I get hate mail, telling me, go back to Vietnam, take your son with you, And I'm like, well, I wish you had read my book, or I wish you had read the book all the way to the end.
Well, I want to tell one what I think is a funny story, because I was reminding the humor. When I went to Vietnam, and I was there were only 3 Americans there when I got there in 1984, and because we had no normalization, no embassy, no nothing, and I stayed. They put me in this hotel in Hanoi, which was, there were rats on the floor. There was nobody. There was 0 tourists in the whole country, except for this table full of Russians from Irkutsk or somewhere in Siberia, and they were drinking vodka. And I turned to my translator, Min, who later became the Vietnamese ambassador to the United Nations, but then was just the translator. I said, who are those people? And he said, oh, they're factory workers from Irkutsk. They won 2nd prize in the productivity contest 2 weeks in Vietnam. And I said, well, what was 1st prize? He said, 1 week in Vietnam. I thought, I'm really going to like this guy. So what are you working on now?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm editing a book called The Displaced. It's a collection of essays by refugee writers on refugee topics. That'll come out from Abrams Press sometime early next year. And the sequel to The Sympathizer. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we want to read that.
Thank you.
So yeah, that's very interesting, because when we leave our hero, our nameless hero, he is in the hold of a ship coming back somewhere. Mm-hmm. He's leaving Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Where, can you tell us where he goes?
Well, he goes to Paris, France, because he's actually half French, half Vietnamese, and I thought, I don't want him to go back to the United States, not yet anyway. Yeah, I did that already. Destroyed the American dream to the best of my ability, and now's the time to take on French civilization in the sequel, and that's the ambition.
Oh, that's, I'm just talking shop here a little bit, but I know you talked to my friend Ed Zwick, who directed Glory and did a bunch of TV stories about a TV series about the Vietnam War. And one of the things that I loved about it was you were going to tell, it was going to be half the American side and half the Vietnamese side, and it didn't go. In part because I think in their incredible vision, the cable networks thought no one would be interested in that side of the story. But you teach film. You've had a long connection to film, and you told me, and I'm going to reveal this, that you read a book on screenwriting, and thank God you turned your back on the dark side, and but that it helped you with your book. How so?
Yeah, well, I encourage all writers of fiction to read a book on screenwriting. Just one. You don't need to read more than one. Because they all say the same thing, as far as I can tell.
Exactly.
But when it comes to plotting, Hollywood seems to be very methodical. They have what they call the 3-act structure. You have to have a turn of the action, quarter of the way, halfway through, 3/4 of the way. And I wrote a screenplay when I got to LA, like everybody does. And it was a bad screenplay, but it taught me the mechanics basically of what that plot looked like. And so when it came time to plot The Sympathizer, I wrote a 2-page treatment, I guess, of the novel, and it had all the turns of the plot and everything. So it was very methodical. Okay, I'm going to kill someone a quarter of the way through the book, just to keep you interested. I'm going to kill someone else 3/4 of the way through the book, just to keep you interested. It's all very, but the point is that it's like you were saying to me, it's a formula. But within the formula, you can do all kinds of cool things. But what I really wanted to do was to make the book entertaining. I wanted the book to be serious as well, about all kinds of highfalutin topics, but I also wanted the book to be entertaining. Because I love spy novels, detective novels, I love Hollywood movies when they work, and I believe that literature can do some of those things as well. That was the hope in what I tried to learn from Hollywood.
Well, I think you took the best out of it. Let me read you something which is from your book. Nothing Ever Dies. What I lost was a homeland that I sometimes do not even enjoy visiting, a relationship with an adopted, left-behind sister whom I have seen once in 40 years, perhaps a happier childhood, and perhaps happier, healthier parents. But then again, if the war had not been fought and I had not lost these things, I would not be writing these words. I might not be a writer at all to whom the questions of forgiveness never occurred until I wrote this paragraph. Now I think, yes, I can forgive in the abstract America and Vietnam in all their factions and variations for what they have done in the past. But I cannot forgive them for what they do in the present because the present is not yet finished. The present, perhaps, is always unforgivable. I find that so moving.
Thank you.
And beautiful. Did you know you were headed there when you were?
No, I think when I started writing Nothing Ever Dies, I started off wanting to write a book about Vietnamese American memories of the war because I thought, we've been erased from both the Vietnamese accounts and the American accounts, therefore it's important to have a Vietnamese American account. But just like the problem with humanity, I knew there was a problem there. Is that all we're supposed to do? Are we just supposed to fill in the gap? The real issue is we need to see what the structure is. We need to see what the form is. And the structure and the form is that no matter who we are, Vietnamese, American, even Vietnamese American, we always want to forget something. We want to forget whoever's other to us, namely our enemies. We want to see them as inhuman. And eventually that journey, realizing that that's what I wanted to argue, took me to the problem of forgiveness and reconciliation.
Right.
After you figured out who your enemy is, and after you figured it out that you've dehumanized them and forgotten them and erased them, and now you want to understand them in order for you to engage in forgiveness and reconciliation, what does that actually look like? What does a just memory look like? What does justice look like? And right now, if you go to Vietnam, many people go to Vietnam and they say, "Oh wow, why did we fight this war? Why did all these people die? Because we were there to to stop communism and grow capitalism, and now 40 years later, Vietnam is a communist country that is basically a capitalist country as well." And people think, well, number one, we shouldn't have fought the war, but number two, everything's forgiven. Mm-hmm. You can go buy Louis Vuitton in Saigon. Everything's great. That's not forgiveness and reconciliation. That's just using commodities and capitalism to help us ignore the past. But the wounds are still there. You just scrape a little bit. Vietnamese Americans, so many of them are still wounded and traumatized and hurt. So many Americans are too. And the Communist Party in Vietnam brooks no dissent. There can't be forgiveness and reconciliation when there's been no dialogue. Right. You try to broach a topic that the Communist Party doesn't want you to talk about as a writer, they'll put you in jail. I mean, literally, they do that today to dissidents and bloggers. So you can't do that and have forgiveness and reconciliation. So we're still a long way, I think, from that. We're well on the way to turning Vietnam into China in terms of having it be a capitalist economy with tremendous inequality. But it's not going to be a just society.
Well,
I'm always such a downer. Oh my God.
No. One of the things that you did that I admire so much when you did this book is it's a wonderful piece of criticism. What you bring into it from novels, film, just the wisdom is tremendous. But you also went out and you visited these places yourself, and it took some toll physically. I mean, it bears it bears the authenticity of witness, is what it does. And I just think that, was there any particular moment when you were out? I know you sneaked into the cemetery outside of Saigon. You went to My Lai. You went to Cambodia. I mean, was there any one place that stood out for you the most, or that affected you the most, that you visited?
Well, I went to Laos, and like I said, a horrible war was fought in Laos. Many people died and all that, and I had a driver. I was on a grant, and the driver was going to take me from my hotel in one city to where I really wanted to go, which was a famous set of caves where the Pathet Lao were fighting their war. But along the way, he said, "Hey, you know what? We should really stop off here. This is another cave where many people died." And I was like, "Oh my God, another cave where many people died. Okay, I just want to get to this destination." But I said, "Okay, whatever. Let's stop." And so we stop, and I get out, and I'm nowhere. It's not in a town. It's in the countryside somewhere. And he says, "Go up there." And there's a trail that goes up, and it's been partially developed. There's rails and everything that go up there. But I didn't notice that there was a museum exhibition hall. And that was a good thing, because if you go into the museum exhibition hall in Laos or in Vietnam, they tell the same story over and over again. And that just shapes your perception in good or bad ways. I didn't know that. So I just went straight up the stairs, up to the cave, this gigantic cave where you could literally drive a huge truck into it. And the story was that there were many hundreds of Laotian civilians there during the war, and an American plane fired rockets into it, accidentally, I assume, and just killed hundreds of people. I was going up this stairway, and there were 4 girls, schoolgirls, Laotian neighborhood girls, going up with me. It was after school, and they were just doing whatever kids do. They had mobile phones, taking pictures, laughing, giggling. We get up to the cave, and of course, they stop at the mouth of the cave and take pictures and laugh and whatever. I'm the one who goes into the cave, and like I said, I'm easily scared. So I go as far as the light goes in the cave, which is perhaps 50 feet into it. And beyond that line, it's complete darkness. And I stop at the edge right there on the threshold of light and dark, and I look into the darkness, and I'm scared. I think, what was it like for people back then, those hundreds of civilians who had to live in the dark, deep in that cave, however deep it goes? And I could feel the haunted presence of their lives and their deaths in there. It was enormously moving for me, and I didn't expect it. I was cynical because I'd gone to all the battlefields, all the cemeteries, all the tombs, and all this kind of stuff, all the memorials. I was just so cynical. And I just felt that in that unmarked spot, you could feel the haunting. And it made me think that for all those memorials that we have out there that commemorate the terrible things that have happened, there are so many more places like this that are not marked where terrible things happened, and we won't know. And then I turned around, I heard the girls laughing, I turned around, I saw them silhouetted. I just took their picture, it appears in the book, and then I went out to join them again, join the living.
Ladies and gentlemen, Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.